At last, we have finally arrived at the reign of Alexander, the reign of the king, the Basileus. The main man himself, Alexander, is here. Finally. Now we get to see what a real empire can do. So, the rise of Macedonia. The Greek city-states, mentioned earlier in my previous slides, the powerhouses of Athens and Sparta and Thebes and Corinth had worn each other out during this long war, during the Peloponnesian War. As these cities grew weaker, Macedonia, a kingdom north of Greece that had always aspired to be a Greek kingdom, was always sort of looked at as a backwater territory by the other Greeks, began to rise to prominence under one of its kings, Philip II, who begins expanding his influence southward. He dies, but his mission is taken up by his son, Alexander. Under Alexander, all of Greece comes to be united under Macedonian rule, and then Alexander sort of coaxes them into being his subjects by promising the Greeks vengeance for the centuries earlier attack by the Persians during the Persian War. And as a result of this, Alexander is able to unite the Greeks and lead them on a war of conquest against Achaemenid Persia. So how did he win? How is it that Alexander, being the king essentially of a third-rate power, ruling over what was once a collection of disunited city-states, manages to put together an army that can conquer literally the largest empire in the world at the time? Or at least I think at this point, yes, it would have been the largest empire in the world, would have been the Achaemenid Persians. So how does he manage to beat them? Well, the answer lies in the Macedonian phalanx. So first, a phalanx is similar to this. This is a hoplite phalanx, an earlier version of the phalanx. And the way a phalanx works is that each soldier has a rounded shield that overlaps. So he overlaps sort of like scales with the soldier next to him. The result is a wall of shields with spears raised above it that is nearly impregnable to the enemy. The enemy spears can't get in here at them, but they can use their spears to poke at the enemy. And in this way, the Greeks managed to create a fairly effective style of fighting that could allow them to remain relatively unharmed while conducting battle, at least in theory. Alexander took the unbreakable wall of the phalanx and added an additional innovation: pikes. Unlike the earlier Greek spears, which were probably closer to 10 feet, 8 feet in length, these 10-foot to 15-foot pikes were massive monstrosities that stuck out way ahead of the rest of the soldiers. The result was that the enemy wouldn't get anywhere even near a Macedonian phalanx before being gored by its massive pikes. Another area where this helped was just the sheer intimidation. The height of these pikes while marching would make the army look massive and impressive as they approached an enemy, striking fear into the hearts of any of the Persians they encountered. This was especially important because the Persians tended to be lighter fighters. They tended to focus on archery and very light armor, allowing for more mobility, but this made them painfully inequipped to handle the heavily armed phalanxes of Alexander. So, setting out from Greece, Alexander begins a conquest of Persia, moving into Ionia and what's now Turkey, through Syria. He diverges down into Egypt, and then back before finally conquering Susa and Babylon and all these other locations. He even makes it as far east as India before turning back due to an innovation he was not prepared for, the use of war elephants, which, frankly, were something the Greeks had no experience with up until this point. Alexander is wounded during this campaign and returns back home basically to die. While in Babylon, he perishes. His empire, one of the ways in which he expanded his empire was through policies that were ironically very similar to the way the Achaemenid Persians expanded. He allowed native people to keep their religion. He actually kept many of the satrapies in place. Sometimes even the same satraps were kept. essentially allowing there to be no real change for the people who lived there as Alexander just sort of swooped in and took power. So, the death of Alexander. In 323, Alexander breathes his last and dies. It's a massive blow to the empire. Its leader, its ruler, dies, and with him, the empire experiences a little bit of a problem. Disillusion. So what happens? Well, Alexander leaves no successor. There's no heir to his throne. So the issue quickly becomes, with no apparent heir, who would it be that will inherit this massive empire that stretches from Greece and Egypt in the west all the way to the Indus River? This is a very large empire, and the immediate concern becomes, who is going to rule it? Well, 3 of Alexander's generals step up, and they eventually will form 3 new empires: the Seleucid Empire, Ptolemaic Egypt, and Macedonia. So the Seleucids, they're founded by Seleucus, one of Alexander's generals. He pretty much gets most of what was previously the Persian Empire, and that's where he sort of sets up shop. His empire is the most massive of Alexander's successor states, but it is plagued by internal rebellions. No sooner does Seleucus take the power than Bactria, or Indo-Greece as it's sometimes called, rebels. These are the territories that were of the old Persian Empire that were closest to the Indus River, and they would rebel and eventually form their own kingdoms. Later on, Israel, that was also under Seleucid rule, would eventually feature the famed Maccabees rebellion, as described in the book of Maccabees, which many of you are probably familiar with from the story of Hanukkah. But at any rate, if you're not, it was a religious rebellion based upon the king Antiochus IV, one of Seleucus' descendants, trying to force the Greek religion onto Jews. Eventually, however, their biggest enemies turn out to be the rising empires around them. As time drags on, Rome begins rising in the west, while Parthia emerges in the middle of Persia, and looks in Iran as people come down from the foothills of Asia. And the Parthians pretty much begin eating up the eastern flank of the Seleucid Empire, while Rome begins converging on their Mediterranean bank. And by the end of the 2nd century, the Seleucids are no more. They are a collapsed non-entity. They are destroyed, with their territories on the coast of the Mediterranean becoming part of Rome, and their inland Persian territories becoming part of Parthia. Ptolemaic Egypt. As I mentioned last time, Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, founds a kingdom in Egypt, and this is Greek rulers and Greek culture in Egypt ruling from Alexandria. We see a lot of blending of their cultures, references to goddesses like Isis, Aphrodite, and Amun, Zeus, and stuff like that. Eventually, in the 1st century, under Caesar Augustus, we will see Rome conquer Ptolemaic Egypt. Ptolemaic Egypt is actually the last of Alexander's successor states to fall to the Romans. Macedonia also falls. Macedonia falls earlier than the rest, partially because of its proximity to Rome, and partially because it being, the farthest west, the closest to Italy of all of them. But the other problem is that Macedonia had taken up the habit, like the Athenians before them, of governing Naples and other areas in southern Italy. The problem is that the colony of Syracuse eventually became a site the Romans exercised influence over, as did Carthage. And during the Punic War between Rome and Carthage, Macedonia backed Carthage. And as a result of this, in later wars, as Polybius will mention, the Romans turned their attention to the Macedonians and eventually conquered Macedonia outright. So first, Macedonia was the first to fall, then the Seleucids, and finally the Ptolemaic dynasty. And so by the time Augustus became hailed as the Exalted One, there was no longer any remnant of Alexander's empire in the world. Well, I hope you enjoyed that lesson, and we will soon move on to Rome.